Okay, welcome to video number 33 of the Diaries of a Coronavirologist YouTube channel. Today is the 26th of August and we are up to about 24 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 and about 820,000 confirmed deaths. So today I want to talk about a story that's been hitting the headlines this week about a patient who has been reinfected with SARS2 in Hong Kong. So this story is obviously concerning, but before I go into the details of what's actually been shown, don't panic, don't freak out. The patient developed asymptomatic disease upon this reinfection. I don't know if I can even call it a COVID case because they didn't develop any symptoms of COVID-19, or at least they haven't yet. But this person seemingly has been reinfected, and I think the evidence is fairly strong for the case of reinfection. Now, the other point before I get into talking about this one patient in the study is that seeing a milder reinfection may actually be something that's common in coronaviruses. So there's 4 human coronaviruses that spread in the population very readily and cause little more than common colds. So these viruses are called 229E, OC43, NL63, and HKU1 in no particular order. And they spread in the winter months. They cause the blocked up nose, a bit of a sore throat that leaves you feeling a bit rubbish for a couple of days, and then you're fine. So they just cause that common cold. And what we see is that people develop about 1 to 3 years worth of immunity and then can be reinfected by these viruses. So everyone watching will have had at least one of these viruses and has probably had multiple of these viruses and has probably been reinfected, but they don't cause anything that you'd consider serious disease. So there is potential that the same could happen with SARS2. There is even an idea that these seasonal 4 common cold human coronaviruses may have caused more severe disease when they first emerged in the human population. And then because more and more people developed immunity because they were infected, they survived and developed immunity for a period of time and then only got mild disease next time round. That's why these viruses circulate as common cold viruses. So maybe we may see the same with SARS2. It's an optimistic hypothesis. But based on this one patient, maybe we now have some evidence that this could occur. Okay, so to get into the patient, he is a 33-year-old man from Hong Kong. His first infection was back in March. So this male developed fever, headache, sore throat, coughing, and that persisted for about 3 days. And then he went and got tested and has a positive test from the 26th of March, and he was hospitalized on the 29th of March. However, at this stage, his symptoms had subsided. So it turns out this is a feature in Hong Kong that if you get a positive test, you go to hospital. I was unaware of this. He was kept in hospital until the 14th of April, and he was then discharged after having 2 negative tests. So one taken from the throat and one taken from the nose, both being negative after 2 weeks isolation, I presume, or at least 2 weeks in the hospital. And then he was allowed to leave. So this was his first infection. Nothing particularly serious. The general cough, fever, headache, nothing more severe than that, even though he was put in hospital, but it wasn't necessarily hospitalization. It was just this is the protocol in Hong Kong. The repeat infection or the reinfection now in question came on the 16th of August, or so the 15th of August, I should say. So here he had just been, the same man had been traveling to Spain and he returned to Hong Kong via the UK. And in Hong Kong, they apparently have a system of screening everyone in the airport when they come back from international travel, so taking another swab. And the patient was again positive for SARS2 RNA. This time he was again hospitalized and was kept in hospital, or has been kept in hospital. I guess he might still be there, being that it's probably a 2-week isolation period. But he has not developed any symptoms. There's been no fever. His oxygen saturation has stayed at 89%. He hasn't developed any headache, any sore throat, or anything like that. So there's no obvious signs of infection from the symptoms he is displaying. So at this stage, there is still the question, though, of whether this is a true reinfection or whether this is just prolonged shedding of RNA. So something I've talked about on the channel before is that there have been some reports of people being reinfected but they probably weren't accurate because it was just some shedding of RNA that seemed to persist. And these PCR tests, where they take the swab and they test to see if there's viral genetic material, only look at a very small part of RNA, and it may not be a full infectious virus. However, what sets this study aside is that they did some whole genome sequencing. So they had the samples from back in March from his first infection, and they obviously had the new samples from August, and they sequenced all of the viral genetic material. So instead of just looking at a small chunk of the genome, they looked at the whole thing. And this allowed them to compare the genome sequence from his primary infection and from his reinfection samples. And this is where the evidence comes from for reinfection, because the two viral genomes that they've put together through sequencing are significantly different or distinctly different. So there are a total of 24 nucleotide changes or mutations. So there's 24 differences in the genome of the virus that was isolated, or the genome that was sequenced the second time compared to the first one. 13 of these changes cause a change to the amino acid sequence of the proteins that the viral genome produces. The others don't cause any change to proteins, they're silent mutations. And one of the mutations causes a stop codon to be inserted in a viral gene, which means it gets truncated, it gets shortened to probably something non-functional. This is the ORF8 gene. And this is quite an interesting mutation, as this was something that was seen with SARS1 as well. So when SARS1 first emerged, it had a full ORF8, and as it spread in humans, truncation mutations occurred that probably deleted that gene as it spread further in humans. So it looks like losing ORF8 may be an important step for bat coronaviruses to come into humans, or at least these SARS-like bat coronaviruses, which I find interesting. And there have been other reports of this ORF8 mutation in spreading SARS2. This isn't something new for this patient, but it's interesting to see in the comparison of the two samples. So clearly these two viral genome sequences from March and April are very different to one another. The other thing that they've been able to do as a result of this whole genome sequencing is compare to banked whole genome sequences that are being taken around the world. So they found that the first sequenced virus from March was most similar to viruses spreading in the USA and England. And now the virus in the patient in August is most similar to viruses that are being put up in places like Sweden and again England. So that's kind of in keeping with the fact that he had been to Spain and the UK on his way back to Hong Kong, suggesting he picked up the virus in Europe, hence why the viruses are similar, although his sequenced virus is similar to what we're seeing in Europe right now. Now, all of these mutations we see are a great way to track viruses. Viruses mutate. Coronaviruses mutate slightly slower than other RNA viruses, but they do mutate and they change. So looking at these changes that occur through time, so from March to August or from January to August when this first started to now, is a great way to track these viruses spreading. And I think this provides nice evidence for the fact that this patient really did get reinfected. At this stage, you may be wondering what all of this means for antibodies and immunity. And they did look at antibodies, and it was quite interesting. Unfortunately, they only had one sample from his first infection, which was taken at day 10 after symptom onset. So when he first went to hospital after getting the positive test and having the symptoms, they took a serum sample at 10 days. So they went back and analysed this and found that there were no IgG antibodies that were reactive against SARS2, suggesting that by day 10 he hadn't mounted an antibody response. Now, this isn't particularly surprising because antibodies typically take between 2 and 3 weeks to develop. So they probably caught him a little bit too early on. So it's a shame they didn't take any further samples from him, for instance, when they discharged him from hospital 2 weeks after being admitted. But that's the situation they were in. When he was readmitted to hospital in August after the positive test at the airport, samples were taken consecutively from the first day, and no antibodies were detected on days 1 through 4. But by day 5, he had antibodies. So this is really cool because it suggests that he has a protective antibody response. This secondary infection, there's positive RNA that's been taken from his nose or throat area, but he hasn't developed symptoms, and he's seemingly rapidly developed antibodies. Now, I say seemingly rapidly developed antibodies, easy for me to say, but we don't know when he was infected. So he's asymptomatic at this point of 5 days after being admitted to hospital in Hong Kong after traveling back from Europe. But presumably, well, he was asymptomatic for the whole period before. So we don't know if this day 5 is day 5 of infection or whether it's day 25 of infection or whatever the number may be. But he has now developed antibodies. So this suggests either he's developed a rapid antibody response that is protective and is part of why he hasn't developed COVID-19 and why he is asymptomatic, or it's an indication that he is an asymptomatic person and may not have developed antibodies the first time round and has this time. We can't conclusively say he developed antibodies from the first infection and that they waned over the period of time because we have no positive result that side. But here we are now seeing antibodies. So it may be interesting to track this patient a few more times over the next few months and see how those antibodies last, what level they are compared to other people, and so on and so forth. There's some interesting points about the antibodies there, I think, from this one patient. And remember, just one patient out of 24 million cases we've had. So some implications of this are that it does seem like reinfection is possible. This patient has 2 quite distinct viruses, and it seems like he's been reinfected. But as I say, this doesn't necessarily mean that antibodies wane really rapidly and that people can become exposed again if they've already been infected. This is just one case. It's one person who we don't know developed an antibody response the first time round because we don't have the samples to prove it. It also doesn't say anything about whether vaccination will or won't work. It may point towards the fact that vaccination may not provide lifelong immunity, but vaccines may be able to provide a better immune response than is achieved from a natural infection. It does suggest, though, that herd immunity by natural infection may not be possible to achieve if this one person or this one case is not just a 1 in 24 million chance. It suggests that herd immunity may not be achievable. But again, this patient developed no symptoms the second time round. So maybe even if people can be infected, they may not develop disease. The virus just may be able to continue spreading. So we may achieve some sort of protection, but we won't necessarily be able to eliminate the virus by herd immunity approaches. And just to circle back to vaccines, my final thing about the implications from this paper, it's probably going to be worth looking at vaccines in patients or people who have recovered from COVID-19 to see what effect the vaccine has in those people. Because if people can become reinfected for whatever reason, then they would need to be vaccinated as well. So safety trials and efficacy trials and all these kinds of things would need to be done in people who have recovered from COVID-19 as well as people who are not exposed. So with all that said, and just as a sort of summary and some final points on all of this, it looks like we have our first well-confirmed case of reinfection. The whole genome sequencing and the fact that the 2 viruses are distinctly different and that you can geographically trace them really does suggest that this person did get reinfected. However, this may not be the case for all people infected with SARS2. This might just be a 1 in 24 million chance. We have so many people being infected with this virus, so many cases have occurred, and so much scrutiny being placed on this virus that we're going to find these kind of rare events. So maybe this is just one rare outlier of a case of someone who didn't develop any kind of antibody response the first time round and was then susceptible to reinfection. We don't know. Maybe it is true, or maybe it's more broadly applicable. Maybe people do have a waning immunity, something I've talked about on the channel before, and then become susceptible to reinfection. But at least in this one case, the person didn't develop symptoms. So maybe that's good news. So I think it's going to be interesting to see if we get more cases of reinfection. as with everything about this virus, it's a constantly evolving situation. We're learning more and more and more every single day. So we're going to find more the more we look and the more time we have. Let's not forget, this virus wasn't around in November 2019. The first cases were just being reported in December and January. So we've had this virus for less than 9 months. So we're still in the process of learning. Let's say antibodies last for 6 months. There were very few people infected 6 months ago. So we're going to learn more the more we look, and it's going to be an ever evolving situation. So with all that, thank you for watching. Please drop a like on the video for the YouTube metrics if you found this interesting or useful. Feel free to leave questions and comments down below as well. I'll try and tackle them, as I feel like this is a topic that quite a few people may have questions on. Please remember to subscribe to the channel as well if you're new here, and feel free to follow me on Twitter, which I post down in the description to the video, as that's where I always post when I've got new videos up. It's possibly the best way to keep up to date with when I put new things online. And as always, please remember to stay safe, wash your hands, wear a mask, and keep calm and carry on. We will get through this pandemic.